What is art?
Art is
history.
What is art? That's a good question.
This is Art Uncovered.
Art is our collective cultural history.
A weekly podcast that brings you interviews with an eclectic mix of artists and creators.
Art is
disappointing your parents.
I'm your host, Kimberly.
They're the beginning of a larger research project that I'm working on that's based on the game Chutes and Ladders. One part of my practice is thinking about and researching different kinds of cultural phenomenon that were translated or impacted by British colonialism in India.
Thanks for tuning in, everyone. That was the voice of this week's guest, Natessa Amin, a Philly-based artist who recently had a solo exhibition at the Q Foundation in New York. She's also the winner of the Fleisher Wind Challenge. In this episode, we talk about Natessa's participation in a unique residency in the woods and her exploration of the connections between her family, migration, Eastern traditions, and the act of painting. Stay with us. Welcome back, listeners. Thanks again for tuning in to this week's episode of Art Uncovered. This week, I am so honored to be here with Natessa Amin. Natessa, thanks so much for joining us this morning.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. So I'd like to start our conversation by talking a little bit about a recent experience that you had. So my understanding of the process is it was part of a weekend residency, and you and a number of other artists were sent to live in the woods for a couple of days. So you showered there, ate there, basically existed outdoors. And then as part of the residency, you made work in response to it. So before we talk about the work, I'd love to learn about the experience. Was that something that was new for you, being in the woods for 3 days without... Actually, was there contact with the other artists, or were you pretty much alone?
Yeah, it was very much a communal experience at times, and then also an individual experience when needed or wanted. So it was new to me in the sense that I had not done something like that alone in quite some time, but I grew up going to a Girl Scout camp that was in the woods in the Poconos. So that was kind of my entrance into being in a kind of uncomfortable outside experience. So there was some kind of like nostalgia or like familiarity to it, but it was funny. We were there in August. It was on land in upstate New York where we were kind of given the opportunity to use that space and land and commune there and make art there. And there's no electricity or running water. So there was just kind of like getting used to that kind of day to day, what you have access to. And the first night we were there, it was like very randomly out of unseasonably cold. So it got down into like the 50s at night. And I realized I just wasn't prepared for that.
Were you staying in a tent?
Yeah, I was staying in a tent. Everyone stayed either in tents or there were a few kind of like platform sleeping spaces, but I was in a tent. And preparing for the weekend, or like the few days, I was just focused on like what art supplies I needed or wanted to have. And I was just really excited for the opportunity to kind of meet new people and have a new experience, that I really only brought like one long sleeve shirt and like maybe a pair of like one pair of long pants. So it was just even that first night of like the kind of like, am I gonna make it? Like I knew I would, but it was kind of like this like mental endurance, just because I don't do well when I'm cold. I'm like fine in super hot weather, but I get cold super easily. But so the next morning, and then I also was like, are other people cold? Like, like we didn't know each other very well yet. Right. I didn't want to be the one that was like, I'm too cold to sleep outside. So we like pushed through, and in the morning everyone was groggy and like, yeah, it was freezing. And then we all commiserated over that together. It was kind of like a little bonding moment. But yeah, it was really special. And I think anytime you have a chance to kind of get out of your comfort zone or out of your like regular routine is like such a great way to reset. And it really reminds me what I'm capable of,
Mm.
which I think can translate also into the creative life as well.
Yeah. I'm curious if was it expected that you would make art while in the woods, or was it expected that you made work afterwards?
Really, there were no expectations. It really was like a place where we were offered time and space and community if that was something you were seeking. So it was a really beautiful experience. And also it was a mix of different types of artists. So there were two musicians, there was a like a videographer, filmmaker, and then there were a few of us that were more kind of traditional visual artists, like
Yeah.
making
Wow.
sculpture and painting. But I think any artist need is like always seeking time and space. So
Yeah, totally,
I
totally.
think that
Yeah.
was like the
Mhm.
common theme. But I also think we were all surprised to find that whether being out like in the wild or out in nature was something that we practiced regularly, it did have some kind of effect on what we were doing, or somehow did create new sparks of interest or imagination. I spent like a whole day kind of sitting in a field painting with another artist who was like weaving these sculptures with grass, and I think that was sort of
Wow.
kind of new for them. And we both kind of would like look over to each other like throughout the day, being like, "Do you know what you're doing?" And allowing this moment of kind of excitement and nuance and openness, which I think was really beautiful. But
That sounds like such a great
yeah,
experience. Yeah. Uh, now so everyone ended up making work, whether or not they did so while in the woods or afterwards, but the work accumulated in some kind of exhibition eventually, right?
right. And we did all know that,
Okay,
yes,
yeah.
going into, yes. So there was a premise that that something would be produced.
Got it. I'm gonna do
Um,
a quick screen share of, can you see my screen here?
yes.
Yeah, okay. So, listeners, if you're listening to this on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or anything like this, you could also check us out on YouTube. And I have a screen share right now of Natessa's website. And here's some works that were created. Now, were most of these created while you were in the woods, or was this post?
So that first one
Yeah.
was, and they're kind of in order on the website of like how they were made.
Yeah, cool.
Um, so the first like two or three were either started or completed. I think maybe like three or four of them on the residency, and then inspired the rest of them. And I've found in my own practice, anytime I'm starting something new or really need some kind of reset or have felt like I'm in some kind of creative slump, referring or like going to the landscape or going and making art outside has always been the way for me to like kickstart my creative
Mm.
process again. It creates some kind of mental clarity for me that allows me to enter into my practice from a new place. And so that was my hope for 3 days, was that I could kind of find something like that. And with the series that I ended up calling it Karmic Patterns, it really lends to this idea that we have these kind of repetitive events or emotions or realizations in our lives. And so I was really kind of wanting to process or maybe kind of meditate on things that I've learned so far in my own work, and also what and like how I could be more aware of my own practice.
Mm.
And for me, that was being in nature, in the grass, being uncomfortable, kind of interacting with all of my senses in the art making practice. It's really important for me, and it kind of allows me to reset.
Mm. Beautifully said. Is there anything else you would like to add about this series or this process or experience?
I guess I might just say that it was also kind of the start of I was preparing for I knew I had two exhibitions coming up in the
Mm-hmm.
following 6 months. So it was a really important time. I was confronted with a lot of things at once that felt overwhelming, and
Mm.
getting to this kind of time or space to just sort of like plan and think ahead and be intentional about what I was going like the fall essentially, like kind of
Yeah.
going to the fall because I also teach full time. It was really helpful. It
Mm-hmm.
was really
Was three
important.
days enough?
Um, I think in terms of like sleeping in a tent on the ground. It was for me, but I could have used
That's
a
a
few
great
more
answer.
days of time with my new like these new friends and art colleagues.
Yeah,
So
yeah. That sounds like such a special opportunity. Is it like an ongoing residency? Can artists still
I
apply for
think
it?
yeah, so Beatrice, who is like one of the organizers, and it's her land she invited us to, and she's
Oh,
been
okay.
building out the land with her partner. So like trails, there's an outhouse. Like it's
Amazing.
still very like something they're kind of building together. And I think the idea is that there will be kind of opportunities every year. But the kind of premise of it was very organic.
Hmm.
Anyway, they like made a call on Instagram stories essentially.
Yeah, yeah. That's great.
Um,
What a
yeah,
beautiful
yeah,
thing.
yeah.
Um, okay, so that was in what year was this? This was
That was August of 2023. So just
2023.
about a year ago.
A year ago, got it. And now your series, Back to Square One, was that more recent?
Yes.
Okay, so yeah, I'd like to
Yeah.
talk about this one now because I noticed some kind of similarities in terms of, at least in terms of the way that the work was kind of labeled and organized. Like
Hmm.
if I go back to the karmic patterns, I think the titles were like Karmic Pattern One, and then the next one is Karmic Pattern Two, and then Back to Square One, we have a similar labeling where it's like Square One or Square Eight or something like this.
Yeah.
Uh, so I'm wondering because it seemed to me that you're kind of setting some limitations for yourself, and I'm wondering if one maybe you could talk about how that benefits your practice, but I'm also curious if that
Hmm.
was something that kind of developed for you while, while in the woods on this residency.
Hmm. Um, every couple years, I feel like I engage in some kind of series like this. And a lot of times I think it has to do with like a more tactile material investigation with things that I'm researching and thinking about, but also it's kind of a way for me to kind of be generative with the imagery that I'm thinking about, and also have a part of my practice that is more intuitive based or really based in kind of play and openness and exploration. And so that's where I think the karmic pattern series definitely that's the way that functions. It also kind of just allows for a kind of openness for the project and for the paintings. And then with the Back to Square One series, these were paintings that I made and were exhibited in an exhibit at the Fleisher Art Memorial in February and March this past spring. And they're the beginning of a larger kind of research project that I'm working on that's based on the game Shoots and Ladders.
Oh,
So,
yeah.
yeah, so that the goal is that there will be 100 paintings
Wow.
and that they will exist in a larger installation that will have different kind of sculptural components and paintings on the ground and potentially kind of like floor, like tough, maybe like rugs that are paintings on the ground. But it's based off of one part of my practice is thinking about and researching different kinds of cultural phenomenon that were translated or impacted by British colonialism in India, which is one part of my background. I'm half Indian. And so Chutes and Ladders, I discovered, originated as an ancient Indian game called Gayan Chapar, which was designed to teach children lessons in morality. And so, like, the top of the grid represented like spiritual enlightenment, and then the bottom represented more like earthly egotism or lack of awareness.
Wow.
And like players would kind of move along the squares, rolling dice, and then advancing or descending, depending on what they landed on. And then the game was changed to Snakes and Ladders during British colonization, and then eventually brought to the US and shifted to
Wow.
Chutes and Ladders and developed by Milton Bradley and distributed by Milton Bradley. So discovering that information, researching it, just there was so much there's so much in there in terms of like what I think about in terms of like the function of chance in in an art practice, or also kind of wanting to understand certain elements of spirituality or my connection to that. And then also it just is like on a continuous theme of me kind of discovering these things that I didn't realize originated in Indian tradition that were brought to American culture.
Yeah, I was reading one of your statements actually, and you in regards to your inspiration. So you said that you're inspired by a number of different cultures and places. So you mentioned India. So do you still have family over there?
I don't have a lot of family there. So my father was born in India, and then his family emigrated to Kenya when he was very young.
Oh,
And
wow.
so all of his family and all of my close relatives lived in Kenya until I was maybe like like a kid, and then eventually all came to the US. So
Oh.
I have very few. We have like some distant relatives that are still in India, and then also a few distant relatives and cousins that live in Kenya still.
So is like African and Indian art some of the like styles that you're inspired by?
Yeah, definitely. I think kind of growing up in the US with an Indian father, my mother is from Pennsylvania, and I've always had this desire to find like a stronger connection to my Indian ethnicity, just because there is this kind of like removal, like there's the removal of being an immigrant from India, but also the kind of in between of like going to East Africa in between there. So um, I think a lot about that kind of migration and the ways that it impacted my family and the family dynamics that had emerged from that. And then also just the combining of cultures that I grew up around, which I think, was super beautiful and interesting, and also could be really challenging at times because I had grandparents that were Christian on one side and Hindu on the other, or like, so like you're trying to, when you're a kid, you're trying to make these decisions or trying to come to some kind of resolution of like, who do I believe, or, what's right or what's wrong. And so I think art for me is like one of the ways that I've tried to resolve some of those questions that I've had in relation to the combination of culture and religion and tradition.
Yeah, I'm wondering if your mark making is also kind of inspired by this, because one of the earlier works, I forget which one. It looked like it was you had some kind of drawing or painting on like the first layer, then you had like a thick layer of black, and it looks almost like you etched away part of a top layer.
Mhm.
I'm wondering, because you used the word like void or removal, I think. I'm wondering if that kind of act of removing parts of a surface or anything like this is something you're also thinking about.
Definitely, absolutely, especially in the newer work. I will say that the beginning of last summer, because I think it's helpful to note, like I did this workshop at the Al Held Foundation, and he was known for using tape as like a tool in his painting process. And the workshop was held by like his longtime assistant, and we actually all got to make paintings on one of his old canvases,
Oh, how
which was kind of
fun.
amazing.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
And scary.
and yeah, kind of, yeah, I was like, oh, this is interesting. But
Yeah,
he
yeah.
had all these like kind of test canvases that he would map out his compositions on, and then like methodically note how they were made, and then he would remake them in this like larger scale.
Hmm.
So we got to make paintings on his like test canvases, which were all still like 6 feet tall. Like they were
Wow.
huge. It was like a
Wow. Yeah.
huge canvas, and we had like basically like 4 hours to make a painting and use all of the kind of techniques that he used. And
Hmm.
I've never used tape really. I've never really been super interested in hard edges necessarily. um, but there was something about that process that kind of indicated a sense of like scar tissue in the process, and that really
Hmm.
struck this kind of moment of realization for me, where um, a lot of times I feel like I think about the painting like a skin, or like a kind of process that is at times regenerative, or sometimes I'm kind of like goring into it, or
Hmm.
removing information, or allowing a reveal. And then and it kind of sparked this interest in thinking about healing and the healing process,
Hmm.
whether that's like bodily, or like mentally, or spiritually, and how that kind of presents itself in my work. And I like both of my parents are in the medical field, so I kind of grew up
Oh, interesting.
surrounded by like essentially healers. Like that was, that was their profession. Was My dad is a surgeon. He was an emergency surgeon. He would like literally, like, if you cut your finger off, he would replace it. Like that was his
Wow.
specialty. Yeah.
Wow. Wow.
So and my mom like worked pretty closely with him. So it just brought up a lot of kind of memories of kind of being in like their office after school, and like witnessing them use all these amazing tools and processes and techniques
Hmm.
to like heal wounds, like
That's
really.
amazing.
And yeah,
Yeah, that's
so
amazing. I'm curious if both of your parents are doctors, was there ever a like an argument or conversation around like spirituality versus science? Because your work seems to be heavily inspired by spirituality, so I'm kind of wondering if that was a dialogue that was in your home growing up.
um not really. I think we were always surrounded by both
Hmm.
science and spirituality, and there was never really a hierarchy.
I'm curious then, because I was gonna ask then if you can kind of identify where maybe like a point in your art career or something like this where like you're interested in like the cosmic world or cosmic experiences, like how,
Mhm.
or if there was like a situation or an event or something that happened that kind of triggered
Mhm.
this desire to explore it through art.
Yeah. I I do think it's having like all of these different like aspects or points of view, or religions and traditions like available. It made me really curious about like where do we come from, and
Hmm.
like um like or even where does an idea come from. Like it's this kind of desire to explore the unknown and continue to be kind of curious about not knowing, and then bringing that into, or I guess exploring that through art making. And I just feel like there's so much of that happens in the painting process, where you are able to kind of get to a place constantly where you're like on the cusp of something new or something that you haven't done before, or you're answering questions that maybe would not have come up in other parts of your life. So I think for me, that's where I get very where the cosmic enters, and that's where I continue to, be endlessly curious.
That's great. So we spoke about, was it last year? You had like two shows coming up and you were a little bit overwhelmed, and now a year later, do you have anything on your plate for the future?
Yeah, last year was the past 6 months have been really difficult, like professionally and then personally, and just a lot piled on. And so I'm looking forward to a few kind of speaking engagements. I'm going to be speaking at a conference in the fall that is about painters who do sculpture, which I
Oh,
think is going to be pretty fun. Yeah, at the College of Charleston.
okay.
And then, yeah, so I'm excited about that
That's
because
great.
it's not always like, yeah, it'll be fun to meet the other artists and talk about like that balance. And then I'm kind of just like getting back into the studio because I had this like whirlwind of two solo shows. And then I also took a group of students to Florence in the
Oh
spring.
my
And
gosh.
so it was just like a lot of, yeah, it was just like crazy.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And so I'm like still decompressing from all of that. But um, I'm really excited about this new project and trying to like really get the paintings, the kind of back to square one project,
Mm-hmm.
get the paintings figured out and start to also think about how I could create more of an immersive space. I
Very
had
cool.
been working a lot in like painting and installation for several years, and um, I kind of took a little step back from that just because I was really excited about painting again last year. And now I'm thinking about how I can make a more immersive experience or like
That's
world
great.
for the paintings to live in.
Very
So that's
exciting.
that's what I'm looking forward to.
Yeah, very exciting. Well, I look forward to following your journey. And listeners, I'll be sure to include links to Natessa's Instagram and website and things like this so you can follow her work also. Natessa, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, listeners, that's all for this week. Please be sure to tune in next week as I'll be speaking with Genevieve Cohn about her paintings, studio practice, and her interest in literature. Hope to see y'all then. Have a great week. Bye-bye.